today let me introduce you anthropological linguistics. Anthropological linguistics. Before we begin with this, we have to know that language. If we talk about language, language is a truly fascinating and enigmatic phenomenon. The scientific discipline that aims to study it in all its dimension is known as linguistics. So the particular approach that studies the relation between language, thought and culture is known as anthropological linguistics. I repeat once again that when we talk about the relations between language, thought and culture, this is what we come to know that it is what we are dealing with, the subject that is of the anthropological linguistics. This is known variously as ethno-linguistics, right? Cultural linguistics or linguistic anthropology. But we have to remember that anthropological linguistics is a branch of both anthropology and linguistics. Traditionally, anthropological linguists have aimed to document and study the languages of indigenous cultures, especially North American ones. Today, however, the purview of anthropological linguistics has been extended considerably to encompass the study of language as a general cognitive and cultural phenomenon, and to determine genealogical relations among languages so as to recreate ancient cultures through them. This is a quote from the Marcel Denis's Basics Linguistics, Anthropological Linguistics in the year 2004. Okay, now coming to the scientific approach to language, when we talk about this, the first attempt to history to describe a language scientifically can actually be traced to the 5th century BC, when the Indian scholar Panini compiled a grammar of the Sanskrit language of India. His sophisticated analysis is the first ever to show how words are structures constructed from smaller structures or units. For several centuries after, virtually nothing was written on language that survives until the Greek scholar the Dionysius Trax, who lived between 170 and 90 BC, wrote a comprehensive grammar of Greek that has remained a basic model to this day, showing how the parts of speech relate to each other in the formation of sentences. So again, if we looked at in the 16th and 17th centuries, the first surveys of the then known languages were attempted in order to determine which grammatical facts were universal and which were specific to different languages. In the 18th century, the surveys became increasingly more precise, culminating, as mentioned in Sir William Jones's assertion, that Sanskrit, Greek and Latin developed from a common source. Shortly thereafter, the German philologist Jakob Grimm and the Danish philologist Ramus Christian Rask started comparing languages systematically, noticing that in some languages the sounds in related words correspond in regular ways. For example, they found that the initial pa sound of Latin pater, which means father, and padam, that is food, corresponded regularly to the initial first sound in the English cognates father and food. They concluded that there must be a phylogenetic link between Latin and English. The method of making such linkage came to be called comparative grammar, a term coined initially in 1808 by the German scholar Friedrich Schlegel in 1772 to 1829. So now the study of sound correspondences between languages such as Latin, Greek and Sanskrit led the early comparative grammarians to conclude that these languages must have all descended from the same undocumented language which they call Proto-Indo-European. So the prefix proto was introduced to indicate a hypothetical language that had left no documentation but which could be reconstructed by the method of comparison. So the notion of proto-language thus made it possible to explain the regular differences in sound between certain languages. By the later part of the 19th century, extensive research had been introduced, inducted on PIE or the Proto-Indo-European differences among the languages descendant from the Proto-Indo-European were explained as sound sheaves of various kinds. So in this way, the early comparative grammarians were able to construct the first ever model of the Indo-European language family, dividing the language into main branches, the language closer in time to the Proto-Indo-European, and the lower branches, the modern day descendants. For example, we see in this the family Indo-European family structure, you will see Albanian, then Armenian, then the Balto-Slavic. Balto-Slavic have again the branches of Baltic Slavic, where Latvian and Lithuanians belongs to Baltic, and Belarusians, Bulgarian, Czads, then Macedonia, Polish, Russian, Serbo-Croatian, Slovenian, Ukrainian belongs under Slavic. And under the Celtic, it belongs namely Breton, Irish Gaelic, Scots Gaelic, Welsh. Then under Germanic we have Dutch, English, German, Scandinavian, Danish, Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, etc. Then again you see under Indo-Aryan, it becomes the Indo-Aryans. Under Indo-Aryans branch we do have the Oriya, Bengali, Marathi, then Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu and others. And under Iranian we have Pashto and Persians. Same thing under Romans, you could see that various languages such as French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish belongs to. So from the research, a movement emerged based mainly in Germany called the Neo-Grammarian School, which formally introduced the notion of sound law. The phoneme p develops to f, and the t develops to p. Such in English are examples of sound laws. To explain exceptions to these laws, the neo-grammarians introduced the notion of borrowing. For example, according to one sound law, the Latin initial the should correspond to English the, as it does in dentals versus tooth. The English word dental, however, has a the sound instead, so the conclusion drawn by the neo-grammarians was that English borrowed it directly from Latin without modifying the pronunciation of the initial the, whereas tooth, when we talk about tooth, which was the expected the, was a native sound adaptations of the Proto-Indo-Europeans word, so in the phoneme the develops to the sound laws. So the work on sound laws made it obvious that the true science of language was crystallizing. Towards the end of the century, the Swiss philologist Ferdinand de Saussure put the finishing touch on the blueprint for the new science by making a distinction between the comparative study of sounds, which he called diachronic, and the systematic study of the language at a specific point of time, which he called it as synchronic. So he also proposed that the new science should focus on language, the system of rules that members of a speech community recognizes as their language, rather than on parole or the ability to use the rules in conversations, writings, etc. So Saussure used an analogy to a chess game to illustrate the difference between the two. Only people who know the rules of the game can play chess. This constitutes knowledge of chess lang, which is independent from such variables as the size of the board, the substance, the pieces are made of, and so on. So the actual use of this knowledge to play a specific game of chess is parole. So this involves knowing essentially how to apply the rules in response to certain moves of the opponent. So the goal of linguistics, as Saussure called it, it was to understand the nature of lang. Now, basic to Saussure's plan for the study of lang was the notion of difference, that is oppositions. You see, this is the view that the structures of a language do not take on meaning and function in isolation, but in relation to each other. For example, the linguist can determine the meaning and grammatical function of the word cat in English by opposing it to the word rat. So this opposition will show, among other things, that the initial consonant k and ra are important in English for establishing the meaning of both words. From such oppositions, we can see one or two features at a time. What makes the word cat unique in English, allowing us to pinpoint what cat means by virtue of how it is different from other structures. So Saussure's approach came to be known logically as structuralism. In America, it was adopted in the early 20th century by the anthropologist Franz Boas, and a little later by his student Edward Sapir. However, unlike Saussure, Boas did not see the goal of linguistics as a study of lang in itself, but rather as the description of how lang reflected the cultural emphasis of the speech community that used it. So linguists would thus have to explain why, for example, in the Indonesian language, the social status of the person addressed is mirrored directly in the vocabulary used, and why in the language spoken by the Nuer herding people of Eastern Africa, there are so many words for the colors and markings of cattle. So in both cases, the structure of the two languages reflects respectively the cultural importance of social rank and livestock. You see, in English, on the other hand, there are very few words for describing livestock, but many for describing music such as classical, jazz, folk, rock, and so on. So you see, it reveals revealing the importance of music of our daily lives. The study of the relations between language and society is such an obvious one. Boas claimed that it requires little or no judgment, or no justification. It requires no justification. By the early 1930s, as American structuralists applied and expanded upon the basic Saussurean paradigm, it became obvious that a standard repertoire of notions and techniques was required. This was provided by Leonard Bloomfield in the year 1887 to 1949 in his 1933 textbook titled Language. So for 2 decades after, linguists went about the painstaking work of documenting the structures of different languages and of relating them to different cultural emphasis using a basic Bloomfieldian manuals of techniques. The first major when you talk about major break from this tradition came in 1957 when the American linguist Noam Chomsky argued that an understanding of language as a universal faculty would never be developed from a piecemeal analysis of the disparate sounds, word forms, etc. of widely divergent languages. Chomsky argued that a true theory of language would have to explain why all languages seem to reveal a similar plan for constructing their sentences. He proposed to do exactly that by shifting the focus in linguistics away from making inventories of isolated facts of language to a study of the rule-making principles that went into the construction of sentence types. So the basis of Chomsky's approach can be seen in the analysis he put forward of the following 2 sentences, which is very interesting. You see when it talks about this, that John is eager to please, and another sentence as John is easy to please. Now when you look at it, both these sentences Chomsky observed would seem to be built from the same structural plan of the surface, on the surface. Because you see here, each consisting of a proper noun, followed after, when you see here, after the proper nouns followed by what? A copular verb, isn't it? A copular verb, and then you have predicate, right? And the complement and complement. So you see here the structural plan of these 2 sentences. You could see it is the proper noun followed by copular verb followed by the predicates and complement, right? So here it means you could see in these 2 sentences here that however, despite the same structural plan, they mean very different things. The meaning of one, when you looked here, John is eager to please. Here we can paraphrase that it means John is eager to please someone. Here it means John is eager to please someone, the meaning of this. Are you clear? Now, when we talk about it, what about the other meaning? You can paraphrase the other second sentences is that it is easy for someone to please John. Here in this case, it is easy for someone to please John. So, the thing what Chomsky thus concluded that the 2 sentences had been put together with different deep structure rules and had become merged into one surface structure form as a result of the very because of this transformational rules. So by the operations, as a result of the operations of the transformational rules, Chomsky then suggested something truly radical for linguistics. He claimed that as linguists studied the nature of the deep structure rules of different languages, they would eventually come to the conclusion that the rules could be conflated into the universal set of rule-making principles. Chomsky's proposals became immediately attractive for obvious reasons. Above all else, it gave substance to the age-old belief in Western philosophy that the rules of grammar corresponded to universal logical forms. Now, it has been pointed out, for instance, that abstract syntactic rule-making principles do not explain the semantic richness of languages, refuting the basic notion of deep structures when we look with the various from the various schools of linguistics. Today, what happened? Today, linguistics, you know, ultimately, when we talk about today's linguistics, you see, today linguistics is divided into theoretical and or the applied subfields. So when we talk about the theoretical, it concerned with building language models or theories to describe languages and to explain the similarities of linguistic research on language, language teaching. Then when we talk about the dictionary, preparation, speech therapy, then computerized machine translation and automatic speech recognitions when we talk about the applied subfield. But when we are talking about the theoretical, we are concerned more with building the language models or theories to describe language and to explain the similarities of language structures. This is what you have to remember, these two important points, remember. And again, there are now also a number of branches that are concerned with the relations between language and the subject matter of cognate academic disciplines such as sociolinguistics. When you see with the sociology and language are the two relations between this language and the subject matter of the cognate academic disciplines as of the sociology, right? And language, so we call it sociolinguistics. Same thing for psychology and language, we do have psycholinguistics. Again, neurolinguistics with the neuropsychologies and language. Anthropological linguistics too is now considered as a branch rather than a separate approach to language. Now, so when we again focus with the anthropological linguistics, the goal of anthropological linguistics is to study languages by gathering data directly from native speakers, known as ethnography or participant observation. The central idea behind this approach is that the linguist can get a better understanding of a language and its relation to the overall culture by witnessing the language used in its natural social context. Given the importance that Chomskyan linguistics, known as generative grammar, had attained in the 1960s and most of the 1970s, many mainstream linguists abandoned the ethnographic method. In the 1980s, however, the utility of the method was re-established by a surge of interest in investigating how language varies according to social situation. Right? So ironically, this revival of interest in anthropological linguistics may have been brought about by the fact that generative grammar research had produced an overload of theorizing, making it virtually useless as a research enterprise in search of universal set of rule-making principles. The ethnographic approach in anthropological linguistics, moreover, was hardly devoid of theorizing. Bowers, for example, collected volumes of data on the Kwakiutl, a native society on the northwestern coast of North America, from which he was able to glean overarching principles of grammatical design. Bowles showed in effect how many of the forms of Kwakiutl and other indigenous languages were reflexes of broader tendencies within the language faculty of humanity for making sense of the world. So Bowles thus provided a paradigm for investigating both language as a faculty of mind and a strategy for social living. To this day, anthropological linguistic research remains a comparative and cross-cultural science. It studies the language of various groups of people in order to determine both their similarities and their differences. Wherever there are humans, there is language, isn't it? So language enables people across the world to classify the things that are relevant and meaningful to them. So all languages have certain things in common. They have what? They have, number one, you should remember that they have a system of recognizable sounds. They have units known as words. They have the grammatical structure and strategies for using language in various personal and social ways. So, a sound system constitutes a group of sounds that speakers of a particular language utilize to make up words. Most languages have from 20 to 60 of their sounds. And you see, words are sound units, individual sounds or combinations of sounds that have a meaning, standing for objects, actions or ideas. Grammatical structure is the manner in which words are related to each other in forming larger structural units such as sentences. So the strategies for using a language for various purposes such as communication and representation are the result of traditions that are deemed important by the speech community. So you see, language is a mental core consisting of certain types of signs and of the structural principles for making and using them. Speech, on the other hand, is the use of language to form and transmit messages. Speech can be vocal, involving the use of the vocal organs such as what? And you just try to recollect, we talked about the vocal organs, that's of the tongue, teeth, lungs, right? Oral cavity, nasal cavity, and all what we have discussed. And speech can also be non-vocal too, as in writing or in gesture. Okay. So let's focus now briefly about what is this linguistic analysis. Okay. So all languages, no matter what sounds they possess, are constructed on the basis of similar kinds of principles. The science of linguistics aims to study these principles in a systematic fashion. To grasp what this implies, it is instructive to introduce errors into some specific subsystem of a language on purpose. This allows one to focus on what has gone wrong, flashing out what structural principle has been breached, and thus to consciously grasp that principle on its own. Take for example the following English sentence into which an error has been introduced. This is adapted from Marcel Dennis's 2004. Here it says, this sentence, here when you introduce the concepts of error and say a sentence such as Johnny, okay, such as Johnny, if you just want to say a sentence which is Johnny is a b-boy who loves pizza. Now if we try to understand it by introducing errors in some specific subsystem of a language on purpose, and that the function, so that this will allows us to focus on what has gone wrong. So when we come up with a sentence like Johnny is a p-boy who loves pizza. So why is the word p-boy un-English, right? What specific principle of English structure does it violate? The question comes, and accordingly what happened, you can check on the principles which you have been preached, or something consciously you can grasp that principle on its own, isn't it? Now here when I talk about this, here the violated principle is not to be located in the nature of any one of the sounds in p-boy, but rather in a specific combination of sounds, namely in the combinations of the and b phonemes when you put with it, which violates consonant cluster structure at the beginning of words. So to put it more simply, no English words exist or can exist with the cluster p, b at the beginning, right? So this is something which we do that. How can we understand the various structures, or where or why does it have happen, and how this is being explained on its own. So you see again the study of sounds and how they are structured falls under the rubric of phonology. So you see phonology consists of two main analytic tasks, that is phonetics and phonemic. So the phonetics is the description of the ways in which the vocal sounds, or in which the vocal organs can modify the airstream in the mouth, nose and throat in order to produce sounds. The phonemic is the identification of the minimum or the minimal units of sound capable of distinguishing meaning in a language. So in English, for example, the p sound is a phoneme because it is the smallest unit of sound that can make a difference of meaning if, for example, it replaces the initial sound of bill, till, dill, so making the word pill, right? So the vowel sound of pill, right? The vowel sound of pill, this one, is also a phoneme because its distinctiveness in sound, making pill, which means one thing, sound differently from if I say pa, right? So which means another. So phonemes, remember, phonemes are not letters, they refer to the sounds of a spoken utterance. So again, if we come to the study of morphological systems, includes determining not only how words are formed, but also what constitutes a word and how units smaller than words called morphemes convey meaning. The word birds, if I say birds, you could see here for the word, okay, birds. Here when I talk about this, birds, what happened? The word birds, for instance, can be split into two morphemes. What are they? Right? Bird, right? Bird and the ending S. So, the bird bears dictionary meaning, and the letter, when we talk about the ending S, has a purely grammatical meaning. What does it give? Plural sense, isn't it? So you see the particular characteristics of again, if you see the particular characteristics of a language morphology have been used by linguists as criteria for classifying it as a distinct type. For instance, language can be classified according to the number of morphemes they use on average for constructing their words. In analytic or isolating language such as Chinese, words tend to be made up of single morphemes. That means one word equal to one morpheme. While in syntactic or agglutinating languages such as Turkey and Turkey, even many of the Tibeto-Burman language, you could see that words may contain several morphemes in combinations. One word equal to combinations of separate morphemes. So we looked at a few general aspects of language and of linguistic method, the approach defined as when you talk about the anthropological linguistics, which is now considered a branch of general linguistics, and yes, in seeing the various subsystems of language not as autonomous phenomena to be studied only as physical objects in and of themselves, but in relation to cognition, right? Then culture and the social systems that they integrate. Bose and his student Sapir are the founders of anthropological linguistics. Sapir's own brilliant student Benjamin Lee Worf expanded the purview of anthropological linguistics by elaborating substantively upon his mentor's views and giving them a more empirical foundation. Through his in-depth study of the Hopi language of the southwestern US, Worf posited in essence that the categories of one particular language are much more than simple mediators of thought. He saw them as being the shapers of the very thought pattern they embodied. So the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions which has to be organized by our minds, and this means largely by the linguistic systems in our minds. This is as per Worf in 1956, page 153. The main objectives the very main objectives of remains to this day. What happened is to study the linguistic systems in our mind, as Worf so eloquently put it. So by this, I do hope that when we talk about the very concepts on how we can deal with the very subjects so-called as the approach that studies the relations between language, thought, and culture is what known as anthropological linguistics, right? So with this anthropological linguists usually they aimed to document and study the languages of indigenous cultures, previously, especially it focused more with the aim to document the languages of the especially the North American ones. But today, however, you see the purview of anthropological linguistics has been extended, right, considerably to encompass the study of language as a general cognitive and cultural phenomenon, and to determine genealogical relationships among languages so as to recreate ancient cultures through them. This is what the subject matters which we have discussed in today's talk. We have discussed the very framework of these introductions. Hope you all get it by now. Be prepared for the next class. Please go through this. Again, we'll take up the remaining portions for today. Thank you all for being